Yes, I had prepared this short set of slides and short introduction to talk about the importance of thinking about what labels we use when we're talking about various modes of transport in cities, in particular the ones like popular transport. And I think as part of a decolonization agenda, we need to be very careful about what types of names we use. And there's a range of terms on offer, and I personally think that popular transport is a very good term, and that's also why we used it for the naming of this session. And next slide, Emma. If we, as Karen was saying, these modes of popular transport, minibuses, auto rickshaws, motorcycle taxis, they are being treated in a variety of different ways by state actors, both local and national. It's very common to kind of accept that they're there, but also ignore them and sometimes pretend they're not there. There's obviously the approach of banning them, which is quite common, particularly with motorcycles and to an extent with auto rickshaws. Ghana is a very good example where they have a nationwide ban on the motorcycle taxis. And I think for with the current elections, or the elections that are happening soon, one of the candidates has promised to take away that ban. And there are actually a range of experiments in various cities already with, in some places, lifting that ban. A more positive approach that we've seen indeed, particularly in South Africa, as Karen was mentioning, was to replace minibuses in that case and try to integrate them into a new modern system, the BRT system in this case. The idea was that a subset of the drivers would go into, would sort of be absorbed by the bus companies and become drivers and staff in those. And there are similar examples of this in other parts of the world. Sometimes there is a desire amongst the authorities to have some of these popular transport modes involved also in terms of access and egress. So for instance, think about auto rickshaws as doing the first and last mile for that BRT system. And then there is a set of approaches that is about professionalizing, rationalizing, and or formalizing services. And actually a very good example of that is what we've seen with the jeepneys in the Philippines, which is why we have one talk today about exactly that and some of the issues and the power relationships and the politics that are involved in all of that. Emma, would you be so kind to move to the next slide? So I think we have three fantastic speakers today who can talk about this topic in a variety of ways, and will in variety of ways also touch on that relationship between these modes of transport and the state. We will start with Benjamin de la Pena from the Shared Use Mobility Center, who will give us sort of a broad talk about the relationships between popular transport and ways of thinking about that. And we'll talk about how a lot of the thinking around these modes of transport still has sort of a colonial set of ideas driven by them. We will then follow up with the presentation by Dr. Sandy Gaspay from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, who will talk about this modernization program in the Philippines of jeepneys in the Philippines, which has been going on for quite some time and is now increasingly also talking about e-jeepneys. And then we will have Bradley talk about a form of popular transport, a type of taxi service that has received much less attention than the minibuses when we're talking about South Africa. He's published on that work before, and Dr. Bradley Rink, Professor Bradley Rink will talk more about that work and what that means from a governance perspective and from a also thinking about decolonial knowledges. So really nicely linking back to some of the topics we talked about 2 weeks ago. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Benjamin, 20 minutes, and then we move on to the next speaker. I'd be very grateful if people could switch off their cameras during the talk, and we'll just have Benjamin and myself showing the camera to save as much bandwidth as we can. Benjamin, please share your slides, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Glad to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you are in. I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see it? I just want to check. Well, can I get a vocal yes from the organizers?
Not yet. I'm still seeing Emma's.
Yes, I can see it. It's fine.
I can see it, Benji.
Yes, there it is.
Cool. All right, then I'm gonna start my timer. So as Tim said, I'm Benjamin de la Peña, or Benji de la Peña, Benjamin actually de la Peña. And I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center and the chair of the Global Network for Popular Transportation. I posted the link on the chat on why we argue for using the term popular transportation. You can go visit that. So a few caveats, right, before I start. First of all, we have to acknowledge we have to decarbonize transportation. Yes, cities in the global south need high volume transport systems. Eventually, right? They really do. But we shouldn't romanticize popular transportation. It has issues. That transportation is a complex and dynamic system. It's never really linear, as the engineers would like you to think. Another caveat is I am not a historian or a sociologist, and my part of the presentation is not a research paper. This is more of a polemic and hopefully kind of a frame where we can start discussing. Second is I am a Filipino, and I am a Protestant Filipino in a largely Catholic country. So I am twice colonized. We can have a separate conversation about that. So I'm going to jump around. Let's jump in. This painting is called American Progress. It was painted in 1872. And it was used in an article, but it got widely distributed in the US. And this represents Western progress, really the takeover of the continent. And what's really interesting about this picture is that woman floating is called the Spirit of Progress, and she has a star on her forehead called the Star of Empire. And what's interesting is the more you look at it, you'll notice technological things. She is holding a book, which represents knowledge, and she's holding the cable of a telegraph pole that is coming behind her, which is communication. And if you look at what's happening on the ground, the Native Americans are fleeing in their ponies, and the colonizers are coming in their modern transportation, including the train behind them. And this was the inspiration for writings on Manifest Destiny. This is the wampum belt of the Haudenosaunee, I hope I'm saying that right, or the Iroquois nation, which lasted for 200 years and had involved 6 nations, 6 Native American nations, spanning Quebec all the way down to Virginia. And what's really interesting about this is the confederacy they built was actually the inspiration for the structure of the American democratic system with Congress and federation. So that's been acknowledged, but not in popular discussions, right? That the Native Americans shaped American democracy. So I'm with the Shared Use Mobility Center. Our mission is to connect people advancing people-centered mobility, change makers, and I'm also with the Global Network for Popular Transportation. It's a project of the Shared Use Mobility. Our belief is popular transportation systems, which are huge, are powerful engines for economic mobility and for creating more sustainable cities. All right, so just some context. The World Bank is this was 2022 numbers, right? Was spending 34 billion in 172 projects across the world for transportation. But the estimate by IEA is that there's about 45 trillion US dollars that will come into transportation projects and infrastructure by 2050. So there's huge money coming in. Let me, jump again. Okay, so I'm gonna jump and say, let's take a little bit about colonialism and popular transportation. And short but typical history, Nairobi, which was created as a way station for Kenya Rail by the British colonizers, grew up to be a white city surrounded by the black city. They created public transportation, but only to serve the white city and the people who worked for the white city. And of course, what happened is people invented their own transportation, and that's how the matatu emerged. This is a really great book by Kendra Mutongi called Matatu, so I strongly recommend it. Jumping into settler colonialism, again, back in the West, it was not all pure racism. There were people who had good interests who said, what we need to do is save the Indian, save the Native American, and we do that by civilizing them and eliminating their own culture. We can see how twisted that is now. The term neo-colonialism was first used in the 1960s as the African countries started declaring independence. And it was this the African Congress, People's Congress, that basically said, the colonialism is still here in the structures, economic structures that favor the colonial powers. So I'm sorry, that was I should have jumped slides. So I'm going to jump into this article that Dr. Jackie Klopp and I co-wrote. And it's a question of, are you a neo-colonial planner? And again, this is a polemic, right? You can, if you scan that QR code, you can find the article. So you are a neo-colonial planner probably if you feel you have a high mission that justifies all your prescriptions. It's either to modernize and make efficient or electrify and decarbonize transportation. That high mission, like civilizing transportation, right, is it comes from thinking that what's operating in the ground, wherever you are, wherever you're working, is chaotic and ungovernable, even if you know very little about it. You come usually with a predetermined solution. It's a BRT, rail, subway, gondolas, hyperloop, and that this is modern transportation or more advanced transportation. Slight example, and my friends from South Africa would know this better, but in South Africa, about 70% of public and shared transportation trips are taken through minibus taxis. But if you look at where the government has been spending money, and this is from the Competitiveness Commission, 1% goes to minibus taxis, and the taxi recap, 99% goes to rail and buses, municipal buses, of which only 3% of the population use them. Here's an example from, and Karen can talk more about this later. I'm sorry, Sandy can talk about it. In the Philippines, we call the one on the right the modern jeepney, which really is a minibus, and the older jeepney, which was cobbled from World War II and lots of ingenuity into it, as the traditional jeepney. And those terms are loaded. Another sign that you're a neo-colonial planner is you're convinced of replacing what's already there, and you think people deserve better managed transportation. You believe you are working to improve things, to bring more efficient systems, because all of these systems that are there are backward and they're fragmented. The key thing is you don't take time to understand what is already operating, and you don't ask what do people need or want. So just a little bit on going on not taking time to fully understand. Mostly we lack data, or you don't have data, but you don't bother to collect it. You use a problem frame, and every report I've seen and plan I've seen on popular transportation starts with listing all the things wrong with popular transportation systems. And at some point may mention some of the things that work, and that's very much a problem frame, problematizes it. You don't take time to understand the social, cultural, and entrepreneurial components of the existing systems. You don't know how many families are supported by these systems, not just the drivers and the operators, but all the vendors attached to it. And then you don't consult with or talk to, or importantly, listen to the workers running the systems. Again, I said you want to import whole systems. And key thing is, in most of these new systems that are bought in, foreign companies, conglomerates, are asked to run it because they're more professional and modern. And built into the contracts is a guaranteed rate of return. so that they will do their business, right? So what happens is they displace current systems. Yes, they might be more efficient, but if I didn't dive into it, in South Africa, I think they have 14 BRT projects over the last decade, of which 2 are operational, and they've spent upwards of $50 billion. No, I'm not sure of the number now. I have to go back to the slide. A lot of money on these systems. And the government has incurred debt for it, right? So it becomes extractive. And so you're neo-colonial if you're not considering that extraction. Also this narrative of, they will be first and last mile, the popular transportation modes. So you only care about the mode you're bringing in, and then we'll struggle to integrate them somehow. Okay. You have one-dimensional performance metrics, usually travel time saved in the corridor. And not about the whole system, not about the disconnections you may be creating, but as long as on that corridor you have travel time saved, that's the metric. You think people losing their jobs and businesses are necessary, they're collateral damage because we're modernizing. And then you don't think the systems that are already operating can deliver better services. It's just this whole, we have to replace them or integrate and accommodate them some way, but the primary thing is bringing the new system in. There are data corollaries to this because there's a lot of data solutions, right? And what we are seeing is you extract data, but the aggregation of data entails a shift in power of who can see that, who can access that, and therefore who has control of it. In another day, we can talk about e-Boomi in India and what that did for the farmers who it was supposedly protecting, and the power it gave to large real estate companies in New Jersey that started buying up huge pieces of real estate in Bangalore, particularly for IT estates. You don't think about the data needs and information needs of the operators and drivers. Usually it's oriented towards the user, right? Or the manager of the system. And more importantly, you're fine with keeping them in black box proprietary systems. A little bit on words, right? Again, I'm jumping around, forgive that, but I hope it is a polemic. The term metropolis comes from Greece, and it refers to the mother city versus all of the daughter cities in the colonies, right? Or the peripheries, right? So it's the mother city. And so you see that metropolitan London, right? Center of empire is where that came from. And it became the Metropolitan Railway within London, and also for Paris, the metro. Right? So it's interesting. I'm stretching here the use of the word, but the core of the root of the word metro has kind of empire and imperial, an imperial sense to it and roots to it. So the question then is, all right, how do we proceed if you, and like I am self-confessing, I was a neo-colonial Pena. I was a big, strong BRT advocate. I still believe we need BRT in many places, but maybe we need to understand how to approach it better. And I think we're starting to learn. So how do we then proceed? Well, let's turn to the wisdom of Edward Said, who said that, this setting up of, I'm not setting up a clash, right? What I'd like to do, and I think what we all want to do, is understand the current systems and then see how these two, the system you're bringing in can borrow from each other. Again, acknowledging the current resources on the ground and how they serve. Going back to my early example, the role of the Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, in actually shaping the ideas of how democracy operates and how a federation operates. And all of that really is this great quote from Dr. Lynn Margulis, who is an evolutionist, evolutionary scientist. And she says, life progressed and evolved not by combat. The old model, right, is like survival of the fittest, Darwinian. It actually isn't like that. What happens is organisms cooperate Sometimes they swallow up the other organism, like the mitochondria emerging in the eukaryotic cell was actually another organism, right? And so it builds and grows by networking and working together. And that's my kind of preachy point for you guys today, to say, let's figure out, as an antidote to a neo-colonial approach, learn from these systems and what can we take from them and what can we improve from them. Listening, right, is the key thing. So this is COP27, so it's 2 years ago, we put in the agenda of the working group on transportation. It was the first time, I think, informal transportation was really mentioned. And the goal was to empower and invest in informal transportation to decarbonize and mobilize towards SDG 11. And the key thing is empowering the sector to participate and in it. Even the word empower, I'm wary about, because it sounds like we have the power, we're giving it to them. And really, it's recognizing their own power and then recruiting them, convincing them that it's for their own needs, right? And lastly, I'll close a little early. This is from one of my favorite inspiring people, quoted by Ted Lasso. And, that classic scene where it says, the important thing is to be curious, not judgmental. And so I hope as we approach the systems on the ground, we become more curious about how they work, rather than seeing them from a solution. We are planners or researchers, planners more that way, rather than trying to solve them immediately, to understand them, and then to understand how they work, to listen to the people who are working in the space, and then learn how to borrow from them, and then to improve whatever project it is that we're working on. And I will end there.
Thank you very much, Benji. That was wonderful and thought-provoking. I'm sure people will have all sorts of questions for you. And if you do have questions for Benji, please put them in the chat so that we can collect them and return to them later after the talks. We move on to Sandy now, Dr. Sandy Gaspay from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, who is going to talk about jeepneys in the Philippines. Sandy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and I'm very happy to be here. Oh, what happened? Okay. Yes, so disclaimer, I don't have research on decolonization of transport, but after getting invited here, I did read up about it, and I think it unlocked a lot of things also. It's like the analogy of people with their backs to the entrance of the cave and not realizing that, oh, there's something more at the back. So yeah, today I'm here to share about a study that we did with an NGO called the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities on electric jeepneys, and at the same time also going to be talking about the modernization of the jeepney sector. Okay, so a quick background. So Benji also showed this earlier. So jeepneys, the jeepney is one of the most common modes of mass transport in the Philippines. So they originated from US Army jeeps that were used during World War II and slowly evolved and were modified by different manufacturers to accommodate more passengers. So they are a cultural icons, as you can see there. They are adorned with artwork and other accessories, and in many places you see you don't even have to wait for a jeepney to arrive. Also in far-flung provinces, they are usually the only mode of transport, and you would see them loaded like this with people and goods, and usually there's just 1 or 2 trips in a day. So this map of Metro Manila shows just how expansive the jeepney routes are. So those are the orange lines. So there's actually the jeepneys and buses, but we don't have so many buses from this map. So they're everywhere. And if you compared to the blue lines, which is the rail line, so they really do form the majority of the mass transit system in Metro Manila. So the jeepneys are known as the king of the road. This is because they can withstand rough terrains and also because of the aggressive driving behavior of the drivers who compete for passengers. There is an average of less than 2 jeepneys per operator. So the operators of the jeepneys are usually small-scale investors. So the drivers would pay these investors daily rent, so usually around 11 to 14 British pounds per day. And the drivers would pocket what is left of the fares after spending for fuel and other maintenance. So this system of this rental system motivates drivers to maximize profits and minimize costs. So therefore, there you would notice a lot of aggressive behavior and usually scrimping on, maintenance practices. So in 2017, the Philippine government launched the PUV modernization program. This program actually covers all public transport modes in the Philippines, including buses and vans, etc. But one of the main focus is really the jeepney, as they compose majority of the franchised vehicles in the Philippines. So it has 10 components. So the government describes it as a transformational large-scale initiative, which is really ambitious. And if we look at the words used, it envisions a transport sector that is restructured, modern, well-managed, and environmentally sustainable, which is some of the words Benji mentioned earlier. So in its communication materials, the Philippine government is kind of sending out this message of, a scenario that is, clean and green transport system and society as opposed to before. And some of the highlights or the desired outcomes for this modernization program are: number one, well-planned routes, wherein the large vehicles are where they should be. The mass transit is where it should be, and it's all well arranged. Next is the consolidation of operators, which will bring benefits and will kind of formalize the industry. So for example, drivers will now have a fixed salary, there will be fixed schedules, benefits and dividends, etc. And of course, the modernization itself of the vehicle. So apart from what we say Euro 0 vehicles, so these would now be at least following the Euro 4 standard. And they also come with attachments like the automatic braking system. So all these that will ensure safety, security, and convenience. So CCTVs, GPS, etc. So that was launched in 2017. So in 2019, GIZ conducted a pilot study of 27 routes in 6 regions, and they showed these metrics. For example, there are improvements in profits, improvements in fuel economy, etc. It's better, it's more efficient, and these kinds of studies, of course, just encourage the government that they are in the right direction. So in 2022, the Electric Vehicle Industry Development Act, or EVIDA law, was passed. So this law essentially provides a platform for government and private sector to support the promotion of electric vehicles. And this law includes provisions on institutionalization, incentives, a roadmap for the development of electric vehicles. So in a 2019 report, there were only around 389 electric jeepney units. So this law is expected to also increase that number, apart from the private electric vehicles. So the study that we did, you can download a copy of this in the website of ICSC, was an investigation of business practices of operators that have implemented electric vehicles. So we did this in partnership with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, an NGO that wants to promote clean energy. And the mission was to look at barriers and facilitators to success so that non-government institutions like ICSC will know what kind of support they can give to accelerate the uptake of cleaner vehicles like EVs. So a common approach would be, to look at outcomes, the travel times, etc. Things like financial viability indicators, capacity, operating hours, revenues, etc. So while these are important, there are several similar studies, but what seems to be missing is an understanding of the experience of these operators as they transitioned under the modernization program. So for example, we don't really know how these successful cooperatives raise their capital, how they convinced other operators to join them when they consolidated, what birth pains did they experience. So it is from asking these questions that we get ideas on what support others could also need. So for this study, the small study, we did in-depth interviews with 3 cooperatives and 1 corporation. And well, we also looked at their financials through their financial statements. So I'll just go through some of these quickly. So in terms of how they ended up where they were, most of the participants were already in the transport sector and started out as tricycle operators before they transitioned to become jeepney operators and drivers. So tricycles are like the tuk-tuks that they have in Thailand. So they were already organized because they had a tricycle association, and some of them already had a cooperative for purposes of, lending money. So most of these operators heard about the modernization program, and they were driven by fear of being left out of the picture, and which is why some of the more proactive members actively searched for ways for complying with the requirements. So another important factor for these case studies was securing a route. So C1, C2, and C4, their local governments already had a route plan, but no takers, so which gave them the opportunity to be the sole operators in these routes. So in terms of capital building, since most of the members were not so well off, a lot of capital were built up slowly through daily and monthly collections. C1 and C2 have also received subsidies from the national government and the local government to help with the equity. And C3 has a special financing arrangement with its manufacturer wherein they didn't need to put up any down payment, but only, give monthly payments. So one challenge was also how do they convince other operators to join their cooperative or to modernize, because there's a lot of, backlash with the modernization. So most of them are actually still compensating the operator. So the operators still receive a monthly compensation on top of the dividends that they get from being members of a cooperative. C2 kind of bought the rights to the franchise in exchange for them agreeing to it. So it's really not free and out of goodwill type of consolidation. So now they're still being compensated. So here are some photos of some of the garages of the respondents. So for example, C1 and C2, they operate both electric vehicles and Euro 4. In terms of charging, some do quick charging at the garage after one round, but for longer routes, battery swapping is better. So here you'll see a battery swapping guy, and they can do it quickly. In terms of batteries, lead batteries were a problem for everyone at first, but now they switched to mostly lithium batteries. And they were also thankful to have found suppliers that offered batteries under a lease model. So this way they don't have to shell out much capital. So now we look at some of the highlights or what were the facilitators to their success. So C1 and C2 are from the same city. It's General Santos City. So in our report, you'll see the names of the cooperatives. And yeah, I would say that they are the more successful cooperatives and usually being advertised as a role model for others to follow. They are growing. I would say they're growing under ideal conditions. So first, they are the sole operators in their routes, so there's no competition in the routes. Second, C1 and C2 are part of a cooperative alliance. So it's a group with other cooperatives, and they meet and they discuss common issues and share experiences. They also decide which units to buy together. And because of this alliance, they had enough volume, I think around 1,000 units to convince a local manufacturer to set up shop in the city. So not only did this lower the price and bring them closer to a source of vehicles, but the manufacturer also partnered with them for the sales of parts. So through this alliance, they have showed also an ability to self-regulate or self-organize. So for example, this alliance, they talk about the problems with operations and they decided, okay, let's have a color coding system, which would normally be imposed by a regulator. So they have a color coding system so that passengers could easily distinguish them. And another key enabler for their success was that their local government was very supportive. So the General Santos City was the first city to submit a route plan, which would be the basis for the routes to be issued franchises. And then the city also provided an additional subsidy on top of what was given by the national government. And the alliance had such a prominent voice in the city that they can demand for better support in terms of, for example, traffic management. If tricycles are encroaching on their routes, then they could get support for that. So with a supportive government and willing operators, General Santos City was the favorite among support agencies in terms of grants, pilot project studies. So for example, here they received an electric jeepney from UNDP. So the more cooperative you are, you get more more benefits. So so the success also depends on how organized the cooperative already is. So for example, C1 is relatively more organized and more established, and they were able to establish additional income from non-transport business like a gasoline station, rental from their land, advertising, etc. So these are the green bars here. So that's their non-transport income. So this table just shows that in the case of C1, the electric jeepneys the green line shows better profits than Euro 4 jeepneys, although the Euro 4 jeepneys are bigger, air conditioned, more attractive. This is because of the high fuel costs. So here operational costs are just 40%, but yeah, for Euro 4 that's 71%. So before, there used to be a lot of misconceptions on electric jeepneys because there are a lot of low quality electric vehicles. So yeah, this makes it more attractive. So then we go to C3 and C4. I would say are trying to survive under a challenging environment. So in the case of C3, C3 operates in Metro Manila. And actually, it operates, and in Metro Manila, because the routes cross different cities, it is the national government that needs to create the route plan. And since this plan is not yet completed, C3 just consolidated, but it has to coexist with other cooperatives. So if you have these bigger routes, it's more difficult to consolidate with the others. So there are many cooperatives in that route. So there is also minimal local government support because they would rely on the plan from the national government. So even in things like traffic management, and also, they couldn't get support from their local government. They also did not apply for a loan under the government bank, so they could not access subsidies. And because their situation is, kind of messy, basically they're just breaking even, despite being in a very high demand route. So for the case of C4, C4 is a corporation, but this is a joint venture between a local cooperative and the foreign manufacturer. So the foreign manufacturer provided all the capital and all the vehicles. So essentially, the cooperative its contribution was just their name and kind of local connections, which enabled this corporation to secure a route. So there were tech issues with the batteries, which led to a halt in the operation for many months. And because they didn't put up any capital, so the local counterpart really don't have any control over the business. So what were some of the common issues encountered? And this is not just with EVs, but with the modernization implementation in general. So number one is competition with, for example, tricycles in many areas. Because the modernization or the route plans only focuses on jeepneys and not necessarily tricycles. So there is still competition with tricycles, and they find it unfair that they have to modernize and spend money while, they still need to compete in the routes. In places like Metro Manila, because there's a lot of, the congestion is getting worse, the more preferred mode or the motorcycle taxis are becoming more popular because they're cheaper, they're faster. Despite the fact that motorcycles currently have the highest fatalities among all modes in Metro Manila. So they are they are rising in popularity, and you can see there's a lot of them here. So in terms of day-to-day operations, we found that, imposing the adoption of technology doesn't necessarily solve problems immediately. So for example, these modernized vehicles need to have an automated fare collection system, or these tap cards. So they are encouraged as a means for reducing driver pilferage, facilitating efficient boarding of passengers, etc. But the implementation is not easy because, for example, the fare structure in the Philippines is distance-based. So we would rely on, for example, GPS technology. And because there are no permanent stops, sometimes, there are inaccuracies in terms of computing the fares, and there will be losses for the operators. Also, different operators have different providers. So if you transfer to another route, then you would get a new card. And at the end of the day, people just don't like it and don't want to use it. So
Sandy, we have we have a max of 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. So, okay, I'm almost done. So, okay. So finally, so as we did in our study, we found that at times it's difficult to separate problems with electric vehicles from problems with the modernization itself. So allow me to share some of my reflections on it. So first, there appears to be a disconnect between, the dream like this and the reality. As was shown earlier in the case of General Santos City, their success was due to a right mix of people, politics, and economics. However, it's not always easy to get this mix right in different cities because key stakeholders such as the local governments and operators have conflicting motivations. So for example, jeepney operators are threatened by the presence of tricycles or these tuk-tuks, but many local governments who are responsible for planning routes, for them, the tricycle sector is a huge political ally that they don't want to anger. So also, there are many requirements for operators to comply, and but the regulators have not really put in place, the appropriate support systems for infrastructure, for example, skills building for the workforce. Now that they've become consolidated entities, and skills building for the relevant institutions themselves. So which brings me to my last point. So problems with the modernization program are often framed as, an implementation problem. But while this is partly true, we also need to acknowledge that our existing, let's say, political system, governance system may not necessarily support the dream, which is why, despite some studies showing the benefits of modernization, some stakeholders are still very much against it. So the question is, will we ever achieve this dream, or do we need to recalibrate it? So with that, thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Thank you very much, Sandy. If you do have questions for Sandy, please put them in the chats and we can return to them later. That was wonderful and a very, very interesting case study of an approach to modernizing popular transport modes. And I'm sure we will be able to contrast that with some of the things that Professor Bradley Rink is going to talk about. He's our next speaker from South Africa, going to talk about the Amafela. Bradley, over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and greetings, colleagues from around the world. From Cape Town, South Africa, which is actually South Africa's mother city, to echo what Benji was saying about the metropolis, and also linking it to the colonial project. So I'm speaking to you from the original colony here in South Africa, and also on election day here in South Africa. And that's quite significant for what we're discussing today in terms of transport planning. Because as you can imagine, over the previous weeks and months, political parties were vying for the attention of voters, and surprisingly few of them mentioned the huge cost of everyday mobility, and of course the historically contextualized disadvantage of many of the urban dwellers in our cities. And how expensive it is to actually just move around and to have a livelihood. So that conversation has really been quiet. And what I'm trying to do today, and I speak as a human geographer, not as a transport planner, so I want to be very clear about that as well. That my work and my focus is really on sort of the everyday and ethnographic encounters with popular transport. So what I'm doing with this presentation is I'm actually revisiting some work that was published in 2022. I'll say some more about that as well. And I really want to critique sort of how we understand transport planning. I call it embracing Southern knowledges, and particularly looking at the Amapela service, this mode of popular transport here in South Africa, which is really very complex, but importantly does not sit at either end of the binary of the formal and the informal. And I think that's really critical for understanding transport planning and thinking about how we can decolonize it. So I titled this Decolonizing from the Void, because the Amapela taxis really emerge from a void in the urban fabric, a void in transport planning, and really a void in knowledge on how this particular transport service is understood and experienced from the perspective of passengers. So I'm going to try to use this example to talk about the topic of today, decolonizing popular transport. And the question, I think I'm going to leave you with more questions than answers, with my apologies, is really how do we plan for and embrace something which we might call adaptive urban governance, which I argue it really sort of exemplifies how Amapela operate. So without further ado, let me move on to my first slide to tell a bit about the sort of outline, how I'm going to shape my talk today. I need, of course, to talk about the mobility void that I mentioned here, and particularly South Africa's history of mobility deprivation. It has been built into the fabric of our cities, the racialization of space, which many think ended 30 years ago, but actually it's very much entrenched in how our cities operate and how people experience urban life, particularly. So I'll talk a bit about that void. I'll talk about Amapela taxis. I'll spend a lot of time talking about Amapela because it's a transport platform mode that we really don't know a lot about, despite my work, which is really a single paper that tried to look into it, try to define what they are, how they originated, how they operate as popular transport. And then linking to the Decolonising project, I actually want to try to critique the canon of mobilities theory, particularly talking about mobilities and moorings, and how infrastructural and institutional moorings that at least as mobility scholars and perhaps transport planners, we think about as central to the functioning of any network. What I'll argue is that Amapela actually help us to critique that and in some ways undermine that canon, hopefully productively undermining them. And then finally, I'll talk about this idea of adaptive urban governance and try to move toward what we might call Southern mobilities. And I use that term inspired by colleagues here in Cape Town from the African Center for Cities, who really have helped to define what we mean by Southern urbanism. And really, it's more than just about the context. That's one way of looking at it. The South, the global South. So the geography of where this knowledge emanates, but importantly, the critique of the universality of knowledge from this Southern perspective. So yeah, so I'll try to frame my talk in all of these elements. As I mentioned earlier, and as Tim alluded to at the beginning, this work really originally was published in 2022. This was part of a special section on informalities in urban transport that was in part co-edited by Tim and other colleagues. So this is work that's already been published, but I actually have, over the past couple of years, had an opportunity to revisit this work and think about how it might be useful in pushing knowledge, at least from the South, forward. So if you haven't seen it already, I would invite you to have a look at that Geoforum special section on informalities in urban transport. So let's talk a bit about the name. It's really important to drill down a bit and talk about where this name comes from, what it means, and how we have to be very cautious about it as well. So Amapela, or the singular Ipela, is the word for cockroach in isiXhosa, which is one of our 11 official languages in South Africa and one of the predominant languages here in the Western Cape province in the city of Cape Town that I'm speaking to you from. As you might imagine, using a name like this to talk about a form of popular transport can potentially dehumanize the people who use it, the service itself. And so any kind of metaphor of human-animal mobilities can be highly problematic. It can dehumanize, again, the people who use it and the service itself. But at the same time, naming conventions, particularly strongly connected to meaning for speakers of Isikwasa. And so when they describe this service, those respondents, those passengers that we rode along with for many, many weeks in the Amapela really use a sort of animal behavior characteristics to talk about the service. So they see it as quite productive, but we have to be extremely cautious about when and how we use these particular terms. So that's just a note of strong caution that I'm going to keep trying to bear in mind as I talk about some of this empirical material as well. So my initial intent in this work was really to focus on the people-centeredness and adaptability of this particular form of popular transport. What I was trying to do is to really look at how adaptive urban governance actually, how it defines the service, what it is like in terms of the experience. But when we talk about transport planning, I think what's important to think about is how we make room for these forms of transport, popular transport in planning, because they do such a great job of evading capture. Again, to use this metaphor that we think about cockroaches, evading a capture. But in many ways, Amapela do evade state control. They emerge from a void of transport planning, and they help to deliver a service despite the failure of the state, essentially. So what I'm going to do here is actually really use Amapela to represent a critique from the Global South, one about the universality of mobilities theory, but also the universality of how mobility systems operate and how they're experienced. So what I want to do is, demonstrate that rather than dwelling on either extreme of the binary of the formal and the informal, that Amapela actually thrive in this intermediate zone, which I call adaptive infrastructure and governance. What I'm trying to do is help to ground our understanding of everyday mobility void. Again, for passengers, people left to their own devices by the state. And for people who seek actually to to fulfill their mobility desires and to seek livelihoods, to seek economic and social opportunities. So I'll try to really frame the findings that way, particularly for transport planners. So let me talk a bit about the void, the geographies of Amapela. You'll see from the inset map here on the upper right that city of Cape Town, of this particular area, the operational area of Amapela is very much, firstly, it's quite far from the CBD of Cape Town, which of course where economic, social, and cultural opportunities are centered. But it's also part of a mobility void where services really are not offered. So we have to contextualize this quite deeply in everyday mobility deprivation that particularly Black South Africans have experienced over the past many decades, and to some extent still do. So this void is almost akin to a food desert. It's really a mobility desert, what it is. The operational area is not served. The area you see now in detail on the lower left is not served by other forms of transport in a regularized way as they are elsewhere. So whereas there may be bus services, minibus taxi services, and to a very limited extent now train services on the periphery of this operational area, within the core of the area, there has, since the 1980s, essentially when these areas were developed, has not been served by public or popular transport at all. So being left without any options, Amapela services have emerged. And they've emerged as a sedan type of service, which was offered by individuals who actually had private motor vehicles that they could offer for the service. So this is one of the reasons why we see this unique sort of platform, sedan type cars that really emerged from private use. So again, to further frame this void, again, I won't spend too much time on this to save time for discussion later on, but we have to think about the historical geographies of transport, which Gordon Puri has done extensive work on in South Africa, forms of flexible or paratransit, mobility politics, the people-centered approach, which, as I said before, was my original intention in this work, and then some of the canon, particularly this idea of mobilities and moorings, fixed infrastructure and institutions that really, again, according to the canon, define how transport systems work. But of course, Amapela exceed that greatly. So let me say a bit about the Amapela topology, firstly. These two vehicles you see, the one on the left and the one on the right, are both Ipela. So they're both forms of this particular popular transport. Very different types, but the same, essentially the same type of platform. But they each have their own unique name, which emerges from the cultural understanding of what this mobility form means to their passengers. The one on the left, called Mshengu. I'll say a bit more about that name now. And the one on the right, the Karvela. Two very different, again, very different types of Ipela. The Mshengu is named after a portable chemical toilet. It is the same name of the toilet hire company for which most of these township areas get their service for toilet services, because they don't have these services in their homes. So the idea of this Mshengu from the passengers we spoke with is that nobody wants just to be seen emerging from an Mshengu, the toilet. And there's a similar amount or a type of shame or sort of different type of meaning of emerging from the Mshengu Ipela. And that's because you use Mshengu Ipela only when you have to, because they tend to be much older vehicles of a much lower quality and only used for when you go to the shops to do perhaps a monthly shopping, which is why they use them with these large boots you see in the picture on the right. So they're exclusively used for runs to malls which sit on the periphery of this operational area. And you can see the driver loading the goods into the vehicle before they set off. The second type is the Karvela, and it's named after this shoe, this type of shoe which is highly desirable amongst many of the township dwellers for its style. So when there's enough money saved to buy a new pair of shoes, this is the desirable one to purchase and to wear and to display. So emerging from a Karvela is something which is akin to a stylish shoe. So in terms of the everyday operation, it's important to talk about how they actually operate and how they emerge from the lack of other mobility services. Importantly, they are demand-driven. They roam around the operational area, and as you can see by the quote on the upper right from a driver, they can stop anywhere. They come and they go, and that's the reason why many of them have dents, according to this driver, because a passenger can hail them from anywhere, in any direction. So it almost feels chaotic in some way, but in actual fact, they are satisfying demand in an extremely efficient way. They also offer a flat rate within this operational area, which is great if, depending on where you're going, you always know how much the Ipela will cost, and you can always negotiate where Ipela will take you. They're adaptive and they're responsive as well. They have a social element of care for each other and one driver supporting another, one passenger looking out for another. But that flexibility and that adaptability is also extends to the drivers themselves. There are very low barriers to entry to being an Amapela driver. Many of these vehicles are not licensed. Many of the vehicle drivers are not licensed. They have a unique system of identification, which usually is not the number plate, because many of them don't have number plates, but they use a series of letters and numbers that they display on the rear windscreen. And this is so the drivers know who owns a particular vehicle.
Bradley, we're moving to 2 minutes.
Okay, great. I'm almost there. So to get beyond this formal informal binary, I want to just show you this screenshot of the government gazette. In fact, these Amapela actually appear in the government gazette, which is the government's licensure, the proof of licensure of routes. So to think that they're fully informal is actually false. They're actually quite formalized, but yet they operate within this formal informal binary, in spite of what we might think. And that brings me to trying to really question the canon, the mobilities theory. This idea that a mooring is fixed, immobile infrastructure and institution that makes mobilities possible. Here's an example I show of a bus stop, the infrastructure and the institution in terms of bus services. But if we look at other forms of popular transport, not just the Amapela, but such as minibus taxis, we can see from this text at the back of the taxi, it says it all. It can stop anywhere, anytime, any place. And this is really something that symbolizes and epitomizes the Amapela as well. So trying to move toward southern mobilities and this idea of adaptive urban governance. So it's neither fully formal nor fully informal. It rather exemplifies what Tim himself has called institutional bricolage, characterized by the dynamic ways of understanding and responding to rules that are open-ended and constantly negotiated. So Amapela operations exceed state control, but they're influenced by it. They're embedded in relational geographies within the township setting, but they're not limited by them. So it's an important consideration when we talk about transport planning. And really what this does, these kind of systems that exceed the fixity of binary thinking that Abdulmalik Simone talks about, tries to pursue repair of inequality, repair of colonialism, and that pursuit of repair is inherently decolonial. As we think about challenging knowledge, challenging the perspective of how we understand transport planning, but also valuing something which lies between the formal and the informal, which is always
you.
complex. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. That was great. And I see we've got some activity in the chat spurred by this as well, people sort of pointing out the problems with the formal, informal binary, and how all of the modes that we've been talking about today actually sort of operate somewhere in the gray zone between those. We have some time for questions, so do please put your questions in the chat so that we can we can put them to our speakers. If our speakers would be so kind to put on the cameras, that'd be fantastic. I was also wondering if Karen, as the co-organizer of this seminar series, had any questions for the speakers.
Great, thanks, Tim. I have a little bit of a statement first, I guess, a quick one, and then a question that hopefully all of you can sort of respond to. But I mean, there was a bit of an elephant in the room in as much as INTALiNC is all about low-income communities. And what we never said was that low-income communities are almost the sole users of all of these different types of informal, popular, whatever transport systems. In fact, they use them a lot. I mean, not saying solely, but I'm saying that, you know, they are a big proportion of the market. And I think you did a really fantastic a job of sort of making it clear why these systems emerge in the desert, in the absence of other services, whether they emerged back in World War II or whether they emerged in the 1980s or whenever it happened to be, and that this is not just an absence of transport, but also a sort of land use planning issue as well. And I think it's also clear that in Benji's asset framing version of it, that they're a huge contribution to accessibility for these communities. I think what's less transparent is like who really making it evident who uses them, who relies on them, what section of the population, how much. I mean, somebody said that, I think somebody said that BRT makes up only 1% of trips, whereas these are making up like 95% in South Africa. I think that was you, Benji. And yet the huge spending on them. And so I think what I want to know is how you think we can make this more transparent within the discourses of the transport planning community, who uses them, who runs them, and is it something about the fact that they don't like them simply because it's people doing it for themselves and therefore taking the power away from the traditional sort of domains of these people, not only the planners but the funders as well. So a bit of a complicated dialogue there, but hopefully you can unpack something from it.
I'll take a stab at that, and starting from the why they don't like it. Right? I think that's a very loaded question, right? And it's never a singular reason. Part of the problem that we have, and I'm going to say not just in the Global South, is that the decision makers, the policy makers, the planners, the media elite are all traveling by car.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this primacy of private vehicles. And so the regard for any other vehicles on the road is they're taking up space in every global city that you go or large city in the Global South you go to. There is traffic congestion because that's a standard product of cities unless you price roads, right? But the blame always goes to it's these informal transportation. They get in the way, even if the number of vehicles is less than 3%, and it's all the cars that dominate the road, and these are at car ownership rates of 20% or less, right? And so there is that kind of centricity of private travel. And so when you look at it, they go, well, these are too many of them. We need to make them more efficient. And the other layer of this is this kind of modernist engineering approach to transportation to measure efficiency, right? And ideas like all the buses have to be the same color. That has nothing to do with transportation efficiency. Maybe it has something to do with recognition, but it doesn't improve rides in any way, but we imagine that that's the way it's supposed to look. So there's also kind of, this is what Bradley was talking about, moorings, right, of our biases in it. And there is a desire, like in my presentation, of we want to make things better for people, but there's a paternalism and a solutionism that comes with it, where, yeah, we want to serve people, so therefore here's the best solution, the most efficient solution. One of the things I learned from South Africa, and I was an early proponent, I was in Rockefeller Foundation, we funded part of ITDP's work to advance BRT there. But one of the things I learned later on was, 500-meter gaps between stops, distance between stops, does not work so well for women after sundown. Whereas your minibus taxis drop you off after sundown right where you need to step off. And it's those kinds of, because we've valorized efficiency and volume in engineering so much, again, the civilization that it brings, that we say we discount everything else.
Then
Your
your
mute.
sound's off. Your volume's off. And again.
Yes, sorry. I still keep having issues with Zoom today. I was just wondering, Sandy, whether you wanted to say anything about who uses the jeepneys and also the other forms of transport that you talked about.
Okay. Yeah, it's usually the maybe middle to low income classes, and especially now that the quality is kind of deteriorating because they're waiting for the modernization, so they're not really maintaining that much anymore. And if I may add a little bit to the earlier discussion, in the global south, I think a lot of the master plans are grants from funders, and usually the solutions there are technologies that they want to fund. So it's the BRT, it's the rail, and it's not really walking and cycling, things like that. Not the everyday mobility, and they don't want to deal with messy things. Something that's quickly can be implemented and can be loanable. So I think in a way, I mean, the policymakers are also being fed these kinds of solutions. I mean, this is the menu, so they just have to choose among those that the funders want to fund. So
Sandy, can I just butt in and say, don't you think the electrification agenda is the same thing?
Yes, I do think so. Yeah, what we were discussing, though that was the the instructions for the study, but that it's not really technology. It's not just technology. It's about accessibility and mobility, and yeah, and then there's a whole debate about the source of electricity maybe is not even clean. So yeah, I do agree with you on that.
Okay, thank you. I got a question for Bradley, and sort of with the influx of Chinese funding for transport projects across Africa more generally, do you see a different approach to these sort of informal, semi-formal forms of transport, or does that not really matter? Is it really the same type of approach? It's just that the funding comes from a different background.
Yeah, I think the approach is very much the same. I don't think there's a great deal of change in that regard. I think the complications come with the outside funding in terms of those funders actually being able to understand how the current systems work. I think this has been a big challenge with the transformation of the minibus taxi industry. Just the dealing with those stakeholders, I think, is really, really difficult for many to deal with. And to grasp that unknowable is a nightmare for transport planners. But I think what's needed is really listening to those who currently operate those systems and learning from them. Like the example of the 500-meter stops. After hours, minibus taxis will actually not just drop you anywhere on the route. They will take you off the route and to your destination, to your front door. Amapela do exactly the same. So learning from that, learning from these sort of flexible systems, I think is really critical.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Emma if she can put up the slides for closing the session, but I'm going to have one more question for Benjamin, and that is about how development finance can be changed to take account of the things that you were talking about today, Benjamin.
Oh, wow. If I had an answer to that, I would rule the development world. If they listen to me, right? These are convoluted systems. And as the truism goes, the system does what it was really intended to do, which in the development really is still keeping the power, right, with the colonial masters, economic power. And developmental resources are actually a tiny amount of the resource flows that come from the global south to the global north and within the global south itself. I think one way to do it is to change the way they think about it, and institutions like Edgar Peter's Africa Center for Cities love that. The work we're trying to do is about that. And we are particularly focused at the MDBs and MFIs and changing their language. If you work with development, you'll know that changing what the program officer may be thinking doesn't translate into what the procurement side of the business of the institution actually can do.
Yeah.
So you want to improve sanitation, the procurement side says we'll buy toilets and just give away toilets. So it's a complex problem. I think there is paradigm shifts, as Donella Meadows, Leverage Points in System says. The most important thing is the ability to shift the paradigm and the ability to rethink the paradigm. So part of what we're doing in challenging and talking and changing, shifting, hopefully will translate to that.
Wonderful. We'll keep supporting you. And once you've found a solution, you come back and explain it to us. Thank you very much for today. Thank you in particular to our wonderful speakers for 3 thought-provoking and very insightful talks, and for the people who've sort of shared their thoughts in the chat, and for everyone who's been listening and learning along with us. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks from now.